Welcome everyone. Welcome to the snowy April Comparative Literature Luncheon. Today's talk is sponsored by Center for American Literary Studies along with the Department of Comparative Literature. Before giving the introductory duty to my colleague Nico, I would like to announce a few events that are forthcoming. First of all, the speaker for the next week for the luncheon will be Angela Naimo, professor at Clemson University, and we will let you know the title of her talk shortly. Tomorrow, our colleague Wee Jung-Yi will talk on retrieving the unarchived survivalism religions in Korean War. Korean War. So Wee Jung-Yoon will talk about
Korean War cinema. Korean War cinema.
Korean cinema. Thank you. At 11:45 a.m. in 124 Sparks. On the same day, Dr. Menachem Ben Sanshon at University of Jerusalem will speak on the case of Kerawan, a Jewish community in Muslim North Africa, in the making of the new Jewish bookshelf at 5 p.m. in Alumni Lounge in the Nittany Lion. On Wednesday, Kurami Ishur, professor at the University of Mauritius, will give a talk on mapping ocean state Mauritius and its unlaid coasts, hydropolitics and literature in the Indian Ocean at 2:30 p.m. in 226 Barrows. On Friday at 10 a.m. in Foster Auditorium in the library, Iranian artist, forgive me my bad pronunciation, Moleh Sialahari will give a talk on digital colonialism and monstrosity. As you see, lots of exciting events are lining up for April. Now, Nico will introduce today's distinguished speaker.
Okay, good afternoon. We're very honored to have Richard Jean So here with us. Richard is assistant professor of English and Cultural Analytics at McGill University in Montreal in Canada. He's previously taught at the University of Chicago, where he co-founded the Textual Optics Lab. He earned his PhD in Comparative Literature at Columbia University. And his first book is Trans-Pacific Communities. Came out with Columbia University Press in 2016 and was a finalist for the Modernist Studies Association first book prize. It's a fantastic study that networks between Asia and the United States. Strongly recommended to everyone. More recently, his research has focused on applying computational methods to the study of culture and literature. Essays in this vein have appeared in PMLA, in Critical Inquiry, and other venues. Please help me to thank Richard.
Thanks for coming out. I'm really happy to be here. It was a pleasant 2.5-hour drive from Pittsburgh, where I'm currently doing sabbatical. I want to thank Nico, especially for inviting me, the Department of Comparative Literature, for sponsoring this, and also the English Department American Studies program for also sponsoring this. I'm really quite bummed, actually, that two people I really like and admire, Sean Goody and Tina Chen, who also helped to bring me, can't be here. They're away at the conference. So I want to say that I'm disappointed to miss them. I especially want to thank Nico and Tina and Sean for letting me speak on something that's completely unrelated to the ostensible purpose, I think, for inviting me. I think the invitation was partly an acknowledgement of some work I've I previously did in American, East Asian comparative studies. My research has dramatically pivoted from that, working in somewhat of a new experimental field of the digital computation humanities. So thank you for letting me do that. I really appreciate it. This is new-ish kind of work, and for some of you it will be contentious, new, unusual, so thank you for bearing with me. It's in part meant to be a kind of introductory exercise in this new type of work. Let me start with a little thought experiment. If I gave you a relatively short passage from a novel and only told you that the novel was written by an American from between 1950 and 2000, do you think you could guess the racial identity of the author? There's the passage. If you know where the passage is, please don't ruin it for the rest of us. But yeah. The first thing we could do is perhaps look at the diction. So maybe some words stand out, like the words fatigue, barges, cathedral, Paris, and maybe something about those words would tell us something about the ostensible racial identity of its author. Or maybe we could look at syntax, the use of passive sentences, the use of complex clauses, the use of similes, like in that last sentence. Maybe we could look at things like style and what we would call narrative form. So I looked out the use of first-person perspective. Paris, the use of setting, like a curse, that's a stylistic feature. But we know, of course, that this is a fairly preposterous and potentially offensive exercise. Racial identity, of course, is performative, contingent on an infinite set of local circumstances. Also, ostensible linguistic markers of race typically attain legibility merely through stereotypes, so the idea that all black writers use these kind of words are basically stereotypical discourse. Also, not all black writers write African American literature, and vice versa. And most radically, some scholars would argue that there's no such thing as African American literature. This is kind of the anti-foundationalist perspective, and thus there's no such thing as black writers or white writers. Anyways, our text is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This is a great novel anyways, highly recommend it. I will come back to this later in the talk. So the bad news, though, is even though this is a somewhat preposterous exercise, every time you enter a Google search, post something on Facebook, or leave a comment on Amazon, machines are precisely using the method I described above, what's called a classification algorithm, to determine your racial and gender identity based on what you write, the words you use, the diction you use to better sell you stuff. So that's the bad news. Here's a challenge. Is there a way to transform and reconstruct existing machine learning or artificial intelligence models to analyze things like racial discourse and language in form in a way that doesn't simply create new or old reifications, stratifications of racial identity? Can we do this in a way that's not racist, more or less? In considering the long and disturbing history of racial science, particularly the history of scientific classification and racial difference, so think of things like phrenology, eugenics, and the bell curve, the challenge is clear. The perils are really obvious. So where does this leave us with so-called distant reading and race? There's a great article by a scholar named Tara McPherson called Why Are the Visual Humanities So White? It's pretty much just a history of the intertwinements of post-war computational methods and computation and racial formation. And the two are really linked. So all the stuff that computer scientists use today emerged from this post-war moment. But in that sense, all of those methods and ideas and technologies are in some way touched by the history of racial formation, which is a serious problem for anyone who wants to use these methods to analyze race, because there's this recursive problem of the methods are in some ways contaminated by ideas of racial stratification. And there's already proven bias. So a group of scientists in a recent widely cited piece in Science shows that the takeaway from this is that a lot of the common machine learning, artificial intelligence methods, they're not inherently racist, but they amplify racist biases that exist in the world. And this has already been empirically demonstrated. So that's the challenge. And so for this talk, I'm trying to figure out how to do a version of what's been called distant reading, a kind of computational criticism for the study of race. The first question is, what is distant reading? So if you don't know what distant reading is, this is a good summary. This is Franklin Moretti's definition. Where distance, let me repeat it, it's a condition of knowledge It allows you to focus on units that are much smaller or much larger than the text, devices, beams, tropes, or geometric systems. And if between the very small and the very large, the text itself disappears, well, it's one of those cases when one can justifiably say less is more. If we want to understand the system in its entirety, we must accept losing something. This is an example of a fairly primitive early example of distant reading. This is from his book, Distant Reading, where all he does is just calculate the average length, both the mean and the median of British novel book titles from 1740 to 1850. He just plots this. It's super primitive, super simple, but he finds an interesting trend that for whatever reason, book titles are dramatically decreasing in length as the century wears on. And from this, he makes a series of close readings and observations, inferences about the British novel itself. So this is a super early primitive example of so-called distant reading. So the earliest versions of this work, mainly emanating from the Stanford Literary Lab, were focused on stuff mainly on pre-1900 literary texts and emphasize questions of style and canon. And you can see this in the titles of these papers. More recently, there's been expansion of distant reading, so some work that myself and some of my colleagues in this area of cultural analytics. So people are moving more into more different kinds of questions, 20th century questions, and moving beyond just, say, the Victorian novel. But still, despite this uptick in this kind of research, scholars have generally avoided thinking about race or taking on race specifically. We're using these methods to look at things like prestige or canonicity, but these things are far less difficult for decks to try to deal with than, say, race or gender. Why? It's because race, by definition, is a mobile social construction and is a thing precisely that cannot be quantified, right? So critical race studies people would say, this is destined to fail because race is something that cannot be quantified. If you try to quantify it, that's bad. Still, I'm going to first argue that race is nonetheless an animating latent variable in current 20th century distant reading. So here's just a really simple example of some early work by, from a colleague and friend of mine, Ted Underwood. All he's doing is he's plotting in a two-dimensional space. The x-axis is basically sales, so measuring popularity. The y-axis is probability of being reviewed in a prominent journal. That's measuring something that you could call prestige. And you put books in that space, and it'll tell you something about the relationship between high and low in the American literary field in this period, what's also been called the Great Divide between high culture and low culture. The thing that jumps out to me, though, is if you look at this, is and if you know American literature, Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Wright, who are both Black authors, they occupy a really central and interesting place in this space. And the question is, why? So here we have a model that attempts to produce measure the so-called Great Divide between high and low. So he's not directly taking on questions of race and gender in this project, but obviously it really matters. Obviously race and gender condition a text reception, perhaps decisively so. So again, just looking at this, you would say like, that's really interesting that Hurston and Wright are so prominently figured in this graph, but why? But that's something that Underwood does not want to take on. So my impetus of this work I'm interested in is that race is clearly an operative element in this research. It's time to make this explicit and to develop methods that more actively engage race as a determining factor. But to me, rather than focus on a specific single case study, I think it's more important to first understand how a computational algorithm understands and identifies race. And finally, I'm most interested, again, not in specific examples of this or that, but I'm interested in how does a machine create a boundary line between categories, like say white and black, what constitutes that boundary and how does it change over time? So these are, to me, are productive lines of questioning. So, so here is a part of the talk I need to explain. So how does a computational algorithm work? How does a classification algorithm work? So I'm going to skip a kind of technical thing. I'm going to explain this in more plain language. So, so actually every day you interact with a classification algorithm. You might wonder, hey, every day or every morning I get like 200 emails and 190 of those are like spam or garbage emails, but somehow my my email inbox knows how to identify which of those emails is garbage and puts it in a kind of trash, a spam box, and usually correctly identifies the real emails. So how does it do this? So there's an algorithm that lives within your email system that basically does the following. So these are actually two real emails I've gotten. One is a spam email, one is a real email. So, so first it's going to look at things like diction. So really specific words like Montreal or sequence alignment method will probably mark this email as real versus your name, spammers, great deal, will probably mark the spam email as fake. Also, you can look at things like syntax. For some reason, spam emails use a lot of like we, whereas you would think that spammers would have picked up upon this and started using it in first-person perspective. I don't know what is going on with that, but for whatever reason, syntax is also a big distinguishing factor. Style, there's again often typos in spam emails. Again, something that you think that they would fix, but they haven't yet. Whereas complex sentences are often a mark of a real email. Also lots of exclamation points, so don't put a lot of exclamation points in your emails if you don't want it to be marked as spam. And last, something that I would call something like narrative, so character, story framing, paratextual elements, so links that are embedded in emails, often marked as spam, so etc. You kind of get the idea behind this. So this is what it's doing. So at some point when someone was going to make the email system for, say, Penn State faculty and students, this is what they did. They collected a corpus of, say, 1 million real emails. Real emails that real humans send to other real humans. And then they collected 1 million examples of a bunch of fake spam emails. And basically, they gave a computer all of those emails, much like you would give it to a human and say like, hey, study these millions of emails and start making like a mental catalog of things that you see that are common in real emails or spam emails. And those things would be like diction, style, parse, speech tags, things like that. And then the computer is going to kind of make an extremely complicated mental catalog of all the stuff that it's seen, looking at all those millions of emails. It's also going to create a kind of quantitative table. So really simple rules like the odds of a spam email using the word Viagra is like 10 times more likely than if it's in a real email. It's going to have 1 million of these little rules. And then that's basically the classification algorithm. However, there's one more final step, which is they got to make sure that the algorithm actually is good. So after this whole process, somebody's going to give the computer, say, 100,000 new emails, half of which are real, half of which are fake. It's not going to tell the computer which is which. It's going to be like, you tell me which are the real ones and which are the fake ones. And if the computer can use its mental quantified grid to tell the difference, like to correctly predict which is which, let's say like a 95, 99% accuracy, then we know that, hey, that classification algorithm is really, really good. It's extremely accurate. It's not perfect, nothing's ever perfect, but if it's 99% of the time accurate in telling these two types of emails apart, then we can say that that classification algorithm makes sense, and they will put it into your email inbox, and that is how spam filter works. So let me do something really naive. Let's just apply this to a literary historical problem. Again, the first thing you might say is like, you shouldn't be doing this. This is a terrible idea. There's a huge difference between spam and non-spam and say white and black. Right? This is ridiculous. So bear with me. I understand that. I completely accept that. But I still think it would be first interesting to use a naive version of this method just to see what happens. And from there, we can start doing more interesting work. Let's just see what happens. So I'm going to use this process to see if we can distinguish between white authors and black authors based on a process of classification. And if we can do this, what are the features driving their distinction? And is this distinction stable or changing over time? So this is my corpus. I have 250 novels by black authors drawn from a larger corpus, about 1,200 novels, selected and curated by some colleagues and friends at Kansas. And these novels run the gamut of all different kinds of novels by black authors, not just elites. It's really, it includes every type of novel that they could find published between 1950 and 2000. Next, I created a corpus of 240 novels, identified written by quote-unquote white authors published in the same period. This is a sample drawn from a broader WorldCat list that we assembled. And then I broke this down by genre because I want to know if genre might be a confounding variable in terms of what's driving them. So I just want to make sure that I had a breakdown of genre to know later if genre is important. So it's 60 bestseller novel, 60 prize-winning novel, 60 sci-fi, 60 detective, which to me kind of covers the range of bestseller, popular, high prestige, literary, genre fiction, and so forth. And the corpus, I'm happy to get into more detail during the Q&A. I'm moving through this somewhat quickly. Okay, and these are the features. So I've already sort of introduced in a commonsensical way how the machine can create a kind of quantified grid to help its work with classification. What are the things that it looks at? So first it looks at diction. So these are just like frequency of individual words, stop words like the, on, remove, so like dog, running, beautiful. Syntax, this is the frequency of part of speech tags. So the dog chased a small cat is determiner, noun, verb, determiner, adjective, noun. Style, things like repetitiveness in a sentence, lexical difficulty, lexical diversity. And also I can talk more about this in the Q&A. I'm moving through this fairly quickly. And last, some narrative elements. So say the ratio of dialogue to narration, the ratio of male to female characters. I have a bunch of, I can again get into this in the Q&A, I don't want to get into the details here, but a bunch of non-trivial narrative elements that help constitute what a story is. Including my favorite, which is just the rates of different kinds of objects, which a collaborator and I, we tried to write a paper using these methods for object-oriented ontology. It was a disaster, but it was still interesting. It was a fun thing to try. Anyways, so these are the classification results. Here's actually a better representation. So yeah, a classification algorithm can classify novels by white authors versus black novels by black authors at the following rates. So yeah, so big picture, it's pretty much across the board, really, really high. So I haven't mentioned something really important. So I work with a bunch of computer scientists. I present this work to people in computer science and information school. Here's the thing, if you know anything about like machine learning classification, these numbers are mind-bending. So these computer guys, they create these kind of algorithms that classify stuff all the time. To say classify, like what are, can you classify the difference between like fraud credit card charges and real credit card charges, stuff like that. And these numbers are extremely high. To just get a classifier above 90% is extremely difficult. So when I show these numbers to, say, a computer scientist, they're like, that is amazing. They're like, whatever is driving these two corpora, whatever makes a difference, is a profound difference. That, again, even if you think this is a ridiculous exercise, whatever it's finding, these results are incredibly, incredibly striking. That's very, very hard to tell two things apart in the world at such a rate based on textual features. And then you might be curious to know, like, okay, so what are the actual specific things that are driving these two different types of text apart? So the way you can think of this is the arrow means that these features, by increasing weight or importance, drives different text towards a category of blackness versus whiteness. So syntax is a big deal. So true thing, I was recently at the archive of Toni Morrison at Columbia University, and she actually wrote this letter to one of her favorite authors. She was an editor at Random House, and one of her best friends, Toni K. Kambar, and she said, the thing about like black letters today is like we really avoid like modifying like language, like adverbs and adjectives. Like we really focus on concrete language, which was like really interesting to have that kind of these results echoed back in the archive of a writer like Toni Morrison. It was really striking. But basically, like some of the stuff, the diction is kind of obvious. The syntactical elements are interesting though, just in that what drives text towards a category of whiteness is really a particular kind of syntax, a kind of language of qualification or modification. And I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A as well. But here, okay, so let me pause though. You might be hearing all of this, and you might say, this is all like bullshit, right? You might say like, I don't buy any of this, right? I don't care about what the machine tells me. And I want to stress a couple of things. I stress that the process of classification can tell us nothing about the innate qualities of text. It does not aspire to assign lexicons to particular groups of white or black authors. So this analysis does not say all black writers use the word it, or all black writers use nouns a lot. It's not saying that. Rather, it is useful as identifying the strength or weakness of the boundary line, the boundary between socially constructed categories of white and black. 93% is not trivial. The thing I'm really interested in is what textual features most animate that dividing line, and how does it change over time? So again, all it's telling us is about the integrity and the strength of socially constructed categories of authorship. It tells us nothing about white writers or black writers, even if those categories even exist. Still, you might have some further objections, perhaps better articulated than what I just said, and I would agree with these. I would say that you're right. So objection one is, in starting with white and black as ontologically accepted categories, are we not just training a machine to think in this reified way and simply report back to us our own binary way of thinking about race? So I gave this talk recently to some colleagues out on the West Coast, and someone straight up asked me and said, like, haven't you just taught a computer how to be racist? I have not, but I think it's an interesting challenge that I want to get into more in the Q&A, or in the rest of this talk. And objection two is, are we not just using quantification to assert the artificial integrity of these categories and assign features to them which only further reify these categories? And I find this an interesting critique that I'm going to attempt to respond to. So the first thing I want to do, and this starts a kind of critical part of the talk, where everything I've just done, I'm going to try to dismantle. So everything I've just shown you, I'm going to show, basically, if you believe that what I've just shown you is really naive and problematic, let's say I agree with you, and I'm going to completely dismantle everything I've done in the hopes of building a better version of this method. Okay, so first we can look more closely at our features in terms of how they constitute each category of novel, and see how they behave over time. We can do this to test the question, are white and black even ontologically stable or commensurable categories within the logic of the machine itself? Okay, so let me explain something called variance. This is a simple concept from statistics, but very important that's going to be useful here. Okay, say you have two classrooms. Both classrooms have 10 students, classroom 1, classroom 2. And I tell you that the average height in both classrooms is 5'6". Okay, the problem though is in classroom 1, all 10 students are 5'6". In classroom 2, half the students are 5 feet tall and the other half are 6 feet tall, right? The problem is that I've told you that the average height is the same for both classrooms, but that value, that number is meaningless because because these two classrooms have heights of students of all different types of heights, right? But if I told you that the variance of height in classroom 1 is 0 because everyone's 5'6", and I tell you the variance of height in classroom 2 is 6 inches, everyone is 6 inches off the average, then that's a more useful description of the difference of these classrooms. But the point is that these two classrooms are not commensurable, right? That you can't predict anything about classroom 1 and classroom 2 because the students are so different based on height, right? Like their likelihood of becoming like basketball players or whatever. There's no way you can learn anything about that kind of prediction. And to get at that incommensurability, this statistical value called variance is really important. So all this says is that each dot is either a text written by a black author or a text written by a white author. The blue ones are text written by black authors. The orange ones are written by white authors. And what this says is the way that black authors use its features, like diction, syntax, whatever, is they're really different from each other. They're like the classroom of everyone's either 5 feet tall or 6 feet tall. Whereas with the white authors, the way that they use these features is really actually quite consistent, it's quite coherent. They all exist in a narrow band, right? There's a lot of diversity and variance in the corpus of novels by black authors compared to the corpus of novels by white authors. And this graph is really, really striking. I mean, the difference is really just visually, instantly noticeable. So what I want to say is that white and black are not ontologically commensurable categories. The very category of black is far more robust and stable than the white category. And here I would bring in some, anti-digital Deleuzian critical theory language, say that one category is really defined by difference within difference, right? Kind of deconstructive category. And that's really, really important in terms of thinking about what even whiteness or blackness means in this framework. And here, I'm going to move through this quickly because I know a lot of you are not Americanists, but this has consequences for critical race studies, particularly critical whiteness studies, to say that actually the category of literary whiteness is more coherent than we've given it credit for. That usually we read whiteness as empty, incoherent, sort of just like nothing. But in terms of the variance of its features, it's really quite coherent. It's actually blackness that has a lot more diversity and incoherence to it in a kind of interesting way. Okay, the second thing I want to do is okay, so your response to what I just did might be like, okay, that's kind of cool, but it still presupposes the validity of like these categories, right? You say like, okay, they're not commensurable, but you still say they exist. Maybe your response is like, these categories don't even exist, it's all bullshit. So I said, okay, I completely agree with you. Let's go, let's take this dismantling even further. So, okay, so the way the machine works is that, it basically tells you like, okay, spam, not spam, white or black, whatever. So the output is always binary, right? It's a 0 or 1. But actually in reality what it's doing is assigning a probability, a likelihood to its prediction. And that likelihood is on an infinite spectrum of values between like 0 and like infinity, right? And if it happens to be at that, on either side of that halfway marker, right? On either side of say 0.5, it's going to assign a binary value, right? Man, woman, white, black, spam, non-spam to that text. But it doesn't have to, right? You could just look at its probability prediction, which again is a value on an infinite spectrum, and you could really look at that value, which is a more interesting value than say the final output of 0 or 1, right? So actually what the computer's doing is much more ambiguous and continuous than we give it credit for. It doesn't have to be binary. And if we visualize it, it would look like this, right? So the 1 value is prediction of a novel being written by a white author. The 0 value is prediction of being written by a black author. And so predictably, yeah, most of the time the computer is correctly judging, right, most of the black novels to be, correctly written by black authors and vice versa. What I'm really, really interested in is when a red dot is by a bunch of green dots, or a green dot is by a bunch of red dots, right? Because that's when the machine is confused or it's screwing up. That to me is really the interesting moment. You might call that the kind of auto-deconstructive moment of the machine's own ontology, or something like that. Actually, an interesting debate where my colleague said, actually the real moment of deconstruction is at the 0.5 level, when green dots are red dots. I'm not sure, but I'm interested in when the machine is confused. So computer scientists call these moments misclassification or misclassified text. This is when the computer misclassifies something as something that is not. When it mistakes a novel by a white author to be written by a black author or vice versa, a misclassification. And I really like this exercise because it's a way to think historically about the non-integrity and ontological contingency and incoherence of race as a binary system of organization. So you might be curious, like, okay, so 8% of the time it screws up. So some examples, so novels by white authors that are misclassified are The Old Man, the Sea, I don't know why. To Kill a Mockingbird, I think I know why. Something Happened, I don't know why. And novels by black authors include Paradise and Giovanni's Room. I'm going to do a close reading of Giovanni's Room in a few minutes, but recently I've been reading more Toni Morrison for a bunch of unrelated reasons. If you've never read Paradise, it's a completely super interesting novel because it's a novel about interracial community where you don't really know who is white or black. It's a really, really interesting novel where it deliberately does that. And a different version of this, I would close read Paradise because I think it's really interesting, but I'm going to go back to Giovanni's Room in a minute. But before I do that, I want to, let me skip this. The last thing I want to say about in this distant reading moment is Oh, okay. What shall I do? I'll do two things. First I'm going to say is, I might not have time for the close reading, but I really want to do it. Okay, the first thing I think about distant reading thing is, computer scientists, when they try to do misclassifications, they say like, that's a mistake, that's an error. They try to fix that, right? For literary historians, I say, let's not fix that. Let's actually thrive on these misclassifications, because we know what spam and non-spam emails are. But if we start with these categories that we know are flawed, white and black, why would we try to fix that, right? We know that they're false, right? White and black are dubious categories. So I would say that if we can track these misclassifications over time, it actually tells us something about the real world racial indeterminacy of these categories over time. So I would say that misclassifications should themselves be the occasion for an analysis to study the real world ambiguity of race as it unfolds over time. So again, what computer scientists would say is an error in the machine, I think is an occasion to do interesting humanistic research. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I want to say is, to get into this close reading real fast. So, okay, the thing I want to say is, the last thing you might be saying like, okay, this is all cool, but I care about the text, close reading, stuff like that. So I'm going to rush through the close reading, but I'm going to say like, okay, there's a way we can pivot back to the text. So Giovanni's room is classified. Okay, what do we do with that? What we can do is we can manipulate the algorithm to figure out, okay, computers thinks Giovanni's room is written by a white author. Why? What we can do is a kind of counterfactual exercise to say, what would it take? What features would you need to change? What would you need to change about the novel to make the computer think correctly that's written by a black author? And all it needs to do is change the nature of 6 out of 57 significant features. And these are what they are. Absolutely very chorus Apollo and white. And if you know anything about Giovanni's room, what's interesting about it is that there are no black characters in the novel. It's this novel that Baldwin wrote to really focus on the question of homosexuality, etc. So in some ways, it's not a big surprise, like, duh, of course, right? That's why the computer is confused. But I want to know more about that specific confusion at the level of the text, at the level of the page. So this is kind of my pitch for distant reading as an interesting occasion for close reading. So, okay. One of the 6 words I think is really, really important in terms of its misclassification is the word appalled. Appalled, I'm like, yeah, sure, that's interesting. It was my collaborator, though, Teddy, who actually is, he's a grad student at Santa Barbara, and he was actually the really good scholar where he's like, you know, I'm going to look up like the OED definition of appalled. And it means to whiten, right? And you notice that one of the other words that's significant is the word white. So no one really ever talks about Giovanni's room in terms of like whiteness. People talk about how its focus on homosexuality displaces racial passing, racial difference onto sexuality. But actually the novel is in many ways obsessed with this question of whiteness as well, right? This displacement of whiteness, which scholars haven't really talked about. Because it really hasn't been a way to kind of get at that question of whiteness, because whiteness is really sort of suppressed in the novel. What's really interesting, this key moment in the novel where the main character, who's a white guy, who is passing as straight, but he himself is gay, living in Paris. At this key moment that he rejects his father's heterosexuality, his father's whiteness, he uses this word appalled. The word appalled only appears once in the novel, but the computer says this word is really, really, really important. If you look at the whole field of literature at the time, this word really confuses me. It's really, really important. And if you look at the genealogy of the word, it's really important. It's really interesting because it means to whiten, to make white, to kind of empty of contents. And from there, we do an extended close reading of this word, how it really opens up the text to do these kind of interesting close readings, to really look at this like suppression of whiteness in the text. So that's really my pitch for how these methods, you can go from distant reading to close reading in somewhat convincing ways. Let me wrap up though. I'd be happy to talk more about Giovanni's room in the Q&A, but I do want to get to the end before my time is up to make a few final points. So yeah, this is what I want to end with. So if you care at all about digital humanities, computational criticism, cultural analytics, distant reading, like whatever it's called, race is already implicated in distant reading. But yeah, people don't really want to take it on yet because the danger and the peril of using these methods to study race, you're likely really to get beat up in the humanities for doing that. So that's why people don't want to do it. But I think it's really important to do it, to try, because done well, it can be really, really powerful. I think we can do more than just critique the relationship between computation and race. I really believe we can we can be empowered to take these methods and do something with them. But distant reading relies on empirical categories, thus distant reading of race must be reflexive metacritical. If you do it in a naive, unthoughtful way, you're going to be doing stuff like phrenology or eugenics or the bell curve. I truly believe that. You got to be smart about it. Distant reading can be effective when its own mechanisms are used to deconstruct the naive categories it takes as its premise. So I really think it's important that if you do this kind of work, that you really think through what the machine is doing and try to leverage its own confusions and limitations to produce interesting new models of interpretation. And I really believe it can also facilitate new close readings of text, especially texts that stand as anomalous to the machine's own logic. So yeah, this talk is really a call for a critical use of computation to study race and culture. But the other point really is that, look, quantification isn't going away. Either we find a way to use it or we remain victims to it. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have a good amount of time for questions. I see 1, 2, 3.
Oh, should I do? Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, I'm pretty much on board with your final slide, but I've got some procedural questions, which probably won't surprise you. Going back to the one about the corpus.
Yeah.
Leaving aside for the moment just how small that sample is, it's really small. The bullet point where you explain how you selected the white text says where they came from, it says nothing about how you selected them. On the other hand, my dear friends at the History of Black Writing Project selected a small number of their huge texts. And knowing them, they probably selected those texts because they have the features that you then find. There's nothing remotely random about that. Then on the other slide, you have this series where you're opposing detective novels, for example, to black writing. I really don't understand that, since there's a lot of detective novels by black writers and so on and so on. And so that needs some explaining. And in the end, for example, all of Frank Yerby's novels, with one exception, will be identified as white novels by this algorithm. And they try to explain both how that happens and what the issues around such a thing would be. But in the end, are we looking at anything really more than, and this is why I want to get to the more granular level of the language itself, which the algorithm is doing. Are we really discovering anything more than that white people mostly write about white people? I mean, a lot of those features have to do consistently with what kind of people you're writing about, since selection's already been made. Right,
yeah. Yeah, thanks for your question. It's a really great question. Yeah, the corpus stuff, now we can talk more about this after the talk, but this is a really important question. The corpus, so my understanding though of what the Kansas people have done is there's no selection, so librarians and academics in Kansas have spent the last 40 years finding every novel written by a black person. Between 1880 and 2000, they found 1,200 novels, which is unbelievable. So and this includes novels written by a former NFL player he published out of his garage, right? There's no filtering going on.
It's serial novels and papers, but you said that they'd selected 250 out of the 12.
But that's a random sample. Yeah, that was a random sample.
It was?
Yeah.
Okay, you need to put that in the slide.
Yeah, sorry about that, thanks.
So how did you do your sample? Was your sample also random, the white one?
Yeah. So the way that we did that, we created a list of every novel. So we created a list of the 38,000 novels currently held by at least 2 libraries in the world, and that returned about 38,000 novels. From there, we created a random sampling system to narrow that down to a number of about 7,000 novels that we're able to acquire electronic copies of, which again has biases and problems in it, but there are certain limitations on what you can do. From that 7,000, I boiled that down to 240. The reason I did that is I wanted the classes to be balanced against each other. So the problem, with the Kansas corpus, we've only digitized 250, so that's why it's 250. It is a random sampling from the 1,200, but yeah. So if I could do like 2,000 against 2,000, I would. We just haven't had the resources yet to. But 240 is enough for these kind of methods. So computer scientists do all these tests to see like how many novels do you need to make these methods viable. And so classification, like 150 is about the threshold. So I feel like 250 is, we always want more, but it's going to give results that are non-ridiculous. The other question, it's a really interesting question. In some ways, look, like a lot of assistive reading stuff is going to tell us stuff that we intuit. I still think that's important to confirm things, to say that is powerful. If you have quantitative evidence to say that, like white writers like to write about white characters, and you have like numbers, like that to me is still valuable. But again, I mean, in terms of discovery, to me, discovering things about narrative elements, syntactical elements, that as far as I know, I mean, scholars have never really written about like a kind of a consistency of syntactical elements in like white literary discourse, right? That's highly focused. I call it kind of syntactical stuttering. That you start noticing a lot, like that. Like they can't just describe stuff, right? It's got to be like relentlessly thinking about this tall, you know, it's always like that. Black writing I find is very different, you know, supported by that Toni Morrison thing. So yeah, so I think when you do this sort of empirical stuff, a lot of the research is going to confirm what we intuit, but the discoveries are also going to be important, even if they're outweighed by like the intuitive discoveries.
And on the opposition between genre and race that you had.
Oh yeah. This, you know.
That's the one that just jumps off the page.
Yeah. So super interesting. So I would say this is where I feel like there's meaningful pushback on quantitative methods that, you know, if you want to do that kind of thing, like say black detective fiction, like Chester Himes, you know, as far as I know, we don't have enough examples of black. We need like 250 examples of say black sci-fi, black detective fiction, which I've not been able to find. So I would say for that question, you might be better off close reading than doing.
Well, they just may not have all been digitized. Actually, probably just digital editions. There's 250 of them, but anyway, never mind.
Right. Yeah. But also, I mean, if you can read all those texts, then you don't have to do, like, this is not a call for everyone to do this work. I think it's useful when appropriate, but, you know, scholars that have mastery over, like, black detective fiction, I don't think I can tell them anything with this stuff. I think they know, you know? So, you know, when you get to, like, really sparse sample sizes, you just close read, yeah. John.
So I was perplexed about two different things. One was the sort of rhetoric of like, I know this sounds ridiculous. Because on the one hand, if thinking about what critical race studies has done, it doesn't sound ridiculous at all. In fact, what it's doing is really showing us the social construction of race.
Right.
What would be ridiculous and phrenological, right, would be if your metadata for who's black and who's white came from photographs and you were lifting the hue of tones of skin or something, right? From those photographs, and then the degrees, you know, you were associating the degrees of whiteness and blackness with those color tones or something like that. That would be ridiculous and offensive, right? And you're not doing that. So because from what I understand, and this is where my question is, the metadata for blackness or whiteness is coming from either scholarly corpora that are already defined in that way, which are defined then, let's say, in this weird mix between this sort of racist version and a more textual version. And so if that's the case, then you know, would it make sense to kind of run this project or is your future plan for this to run the project a number of ways for sort of intersectional kind of questions, and you're going to do different genders, and you're going to do, I don't know, classes, and are you interested in sort of pursuing non-binary versions of identity as you go forward? Right. And if so, you know, what would be the categories, and where would we get that data?
Yeah. Great question. So yeah, a really important point that I glossed over. But yeah, the process of identifying authors by race was a fairly rigorous process conducted by a team of scholars where the threshold had to be, we had to find a credible scholar identifying an author as such and such, man, woman, white, black, Asian American, whatever, in a credible scholarly source, or the author had to self-identify as such. So there was no like looking at photographs or whatever, which, I mean, black scholars did that. You know, the famous story about the author of Magna, you know, that there was confusion because scholars just would look at photographs of authors. So we maintain a higher threshold. Still problematic, but I think the best we can do at this point. In terms of, I'm really interested in going beyond the binary classification. For the work I'm doing that's more content-based, so I'm writing like a book that's really about post-war US culture. I don't do this kind of work because it's somewhat disembodied from history or whatever. It's just like these categories, right? Like an example of some work I've been doing is really categories of, say, bestseller, prize winners, and say blackness, and to see how those triangulate. There are other things you could do. You could add gender, but I think really grounding it in historical categories would be most important. So the category of the bestseller is a real category. The category, the African American novel, that's a category, and you can see how they interact in different ways. Yeah, I don't really love this case study a ton because it exists in like this almost like kind of weird transhistorical category of whiteness and blackness. I think when they're linked to institutions or socially meaningful categories in literary history, that's better. So yeah, there's tons of things we can do with it. Yeah.
There's Jolly.
Hi. Just a couple of questions. First of all, I would argue that there's no way that your sample is random. It's semi-purposive.
Right.
Okay. I mean, it just isn't. Random is a completely different piece, and I can explain that if you want me to do that. So I reject the idea that this is a random sample. This is a very, very purposive sample.
Right.
Okay. Second of all, and one of those elements, and maybe you want a semi-purposive sample, but then you want to say that, right? So one of the purposive sampling pieces of it is it's American.
Right.
You know, so you're leaving that out. You also haven't stated what your independent, dependent, and confounding variables are.
Right.
So I have very little idea of how to assess this. And I would like to point out that, you know, torture the data and it will confess, as my stats teacher taught me long ago. You know, we need to understand much better. You're talking about what the computer believes and gets wrong. Well, when the computer gets something wrong in this kind of programming, we call it an outlier, and then we don't try to fix the computer. We try to figure out why it's an outlier. So there's a difference between a complete error and an outlier.
Right.
So I think you're simplifying your sense of what programming does. There's not anything inherent in the computer that figures out how to do sampling and run the stats programs that do our analysis. So I have to say I'm a little concerned about your methodology, especially the reification of black and white without attention to the fact that you're not doing, as you yourself pointed out, a longitudinal study. Right? So that's one thing. And second of all, the reification of black and whiteness within Americanness, you're going to get a whole bunch of different readings if you move towards even Anglo-global literature. So I have some very big methodological concerns.
Okay. Yeah, so the experimental design is machine learning.
And I would also like to point out that p-value itself is a fiction.
Yeah, we're not using p-values for this. Yeah, we're using a machine learning cross-validation method. I'll walk through the machine learning with you. So the experimental design is machine learning where what we did is...
So when you were putting a 0.5 value, you weren't talking about the p-value of error?
No.
Okay, well even that would be helpful to know.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, this is more for a humanist audience, so I don't want to... Yeah, but I didn't want to get too much. So the experimental design, so the terms you're using like p-values, confounding variables, things like that, it's more of a traditional statistical framework. I'm in a more machine learning framework where basically what we put into the model is literally a million variables, including gender, race. So it's accounting for any potential confounding or correlation between variables. What machine learning can do is through a kind of recursion feature selection is figuring out which are the variables that are most significant in the prediction. In terms of the language of outlier versus misclassification, it's not an outlier. It's pretty much literally a misclassification. The language of outlier in a kind of traditional statistical framework, I don't know how to move that to a machine learning framework. All I'm saying pretty much is in terms of the validation, how well the model performs. We did cross-validation, and it performs at, I think it was like a 93% accuracy. So that's how we can test. So yeah, in terms of the validation of the model is validation through this. The model is validated through that process. It is validated at a statistically non-trivial rates. In terms of, again, outlier versus misclassification, I mean, misclassification is the specific technical term for machine learning when the machine makes a mistake. In terms of misclassification, And again, that was the occasion for me to do something with that. But yes, I mean, when...
What about the personification of the computer program?
Yeah, that's just rhetorical. I mean, at every stage there's like humans, like I make a decision. I mean, that, yeah, I think rhetorically that might have been misstep. When I presented this work again to a particular kind of audience, I personify it to, yeah, I think what I should rhetorically do is really show that it's the human interacting with the machine to create all these decisions. Yeah. In terms of random sampling, that's just like a technical term, though. I mean, yeah,
It's
I mean...
not a technical term, it has a very, very specific meaning in statistics.
Yeah, but when I do the random sample, I have a collection of 1,200 texts, and I literally randomly select 250 from those using a permutation algorithm.
But the ones that are already chosen.
Oh, of course, yeah, of course.
Data. So for example, just for people around there, a complete random sample is
Right.
when I decide I'm going to random sample people for the kind of work I used to do in South Africa, and I pick them up with a GPS point. And I don't ask whether they're white or black or anything. That is a completely non-purposive sample. So I think that you need to figure out what you're going to call this, because it's not completely random, to Alden's point.
Yeah, it's a random selection of a highly curated corpus by group
Exactly,
style.
which
Sure.
means that it's not random. So I'm just suggesting that we nuance the language to give your study more credit.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, Karen.
I guess I don't have the technical background even to very clearly explain what makes me uneasy, but I guess I'm uneasy about the process, and I'm worried that the whole thing may be circular. In other words, that you have fed your program what you need in order to come out with exactly what you expected to find, with a few interesting exceptions here and there. But among the things I'm wondering is, did you correct for access to education? Is it possible that that is a cross-cutting characteristic? Are you sure that you are studying? Because again and again and again and again, you refer to black and white and to race.
Right.
Are you sure that is what you are studying, that you're not studying a set of complex interactions of other characteristics? If you really think that you can tell the difference, or that the machine can validate the difference between black and white, you ought to be able to pick this up and go to another part of the world. This may relate to what Rose was saying, where the population may be predominantly black,
Right.
and where white cultural production would be a minority, and then try it out there to make sure that what you are studying is not minority-majority cultural production. It seems to me as if there have been, despite the fact that in the second half of the talk that you dismantled some of what was in the first, or you offered to dismantle some of what was in the first part of the talk, it still seems to me that you're going at it with fairly blunt definitions that have been previously decided to be the right answers.
Right, yeah.
And that's what concerns me, and I find myself thinking, how about a biracial writer? How about writers who spend part of their career in one country, one cultural situation, and then they move elsewhere?
Right.
How about all the ways in which the real world does not fit the binary that is essential to your whole inquiry as you've described it?
Yeah, no, this is a really important. So I draw a lot from social scientists who, what social scientists believe to work on race is what I believe is these categories of white and black are never meaningful by themselves.
Then why use them?
So this is why I use them, right? That basically social scientists believe that they are proxies or stand-ins for more complicated processes, let's say education, whatever. So to claim, this is a question of how you frame the argument. It's a question about causality, right? It's to say like, are these categories, definitions, white or black, are they causing things, right? Or are they merely proxies for other more complicated factors that are causing things, right? Blackness does not cause poverty in itself. It's like lack of education, lack of resources, whatever, right? So the category of blackness stands in for a bunch of complicated social determinants, right? I believe that, and that's what I'm hoping to try to show. Why, okay, so I would say, you know, for social scientists, why do you do this, right? So take like the redlining studies of, say, Southside Chicago, right? Social scientists very naively went door to door, right? Knocked on doors and said, are you white or black, right? Totally naive and problematic, right? We would scoff at that, right? They did that, they did this research, and they found that there's an intense pattern where banks do not loan to families in this area that's primarily populated by black people, right? And because we found that pattern, they changed the laws That's incredibly important research. If scholars did not go door to door, begin with preposterous assumptions about racial identification, right? You could say every time someone says, I am white, that is aligning super complicated process of education, right? That there are poor black people, there are rich white people, poor black people, rich black people on the South Side. All those things are erased by the stupid, naive survey, right? But I'm glad they did that study, because otherwise we wouldn't know redlining exists, right? And the laws would not be changed. So I'm interested in finding patterns in these social constructions of race, because they're useful proxies for, yes, other things, but sometimes they can provide pithy descriptions and proxies for, again, patterns that we should get at with further research, but they are not trivial patterns. And they can point us to deeper questions about things that are happening. And if we don't do that, then we can't get at other questions that are really important for literary and cultural history in terms of inequality in the literary field, who wins prizes, things like that, that to me correlate to the importance of a redlining study. So that's where I'm coming from. Yeah.
I'm not so much interested, or I'm not capable of doing digital humanities, but I wanted to talk about the distant reading part, right, and our common interest in history. Right. So I wanted to, I very much agree with you that in many ways I agree to giving attention to these categories, because historically these categories have done real work, right? So no matter how much amount of deconstruction or post-structuralism you do, blurring the boundaries, right, you can't obliterate this history of them doing real amount of work, right? So that I very much, agree. But I'm interested, I guess, more in sort of my puzzlement when I teach Moretti, which is this almost, he himself is like so invested in history when it comes to readings of Victorian novel, but this whole methodology of the distant reading seems to not recognize it. One of my bigger problems with regard to particularly my context is there was actually no engagement with, let's say, geopolitics or Cold War, right? So for instance, distant reading is very much about world system, which has existed since 16th century. And that's like thinking about capitalism, but not thinking about, let's say, how, state politics or geopolitical considerations, configure the field of literature. So I wanted to hear more about your thinking about how to think of distant reading in useful ways while thinking of these quote-unquote systems as actually not immutable over time.
Wait, could you, this is an interesting question. Could you, so it's specifically, how can distant reading be useful in being brought to bear on questions of how the world system works, or is it a question about the genealogy?
Like say for instance, there have been scholars such as Laura Doyle, who has talked about earlier modern studies, right? Who talk about other empires, other histories that completely question the validity of Wallerstein, right? Because if you think about empires as historically existing as in many ways inter-imperiality, this kind of centrality of the center and the periphery, and then all that is really questionable. And I'm a little bit concerned by how methods such as distant reading, or more specifically Moretti, simply locks onto the moment of globalization and not thinking about other systems, other forms of systems.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I don't see. I'm not sure I've seen Moretti really bring together these two interests. The distant reading work he does is incredibly actually apolitical. It's really he's just literally counting sentence lengths, whereas his world systems work around world literature is somewhat different. So I'm trying to understand your question of how these two things come together. That he's really held distant reading and the world system stuff really separate, that he hasn't really seen a connection between those two.
Well, that's not true. In his literature, in his two essays on world literature, he's very much saying that world literature is a product of this kind of disagreement.
Oh, okay, that's, okay, so, oh, I see, okay, sorry, I'm getting the question now. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so how can distant reading produce a different kind of conception of world literature? How can it act as a different kind of genealogy for this
Yeah, in
category?
different times even.
You would have to do a comparative. You'd have to do a comparative longitudinal.
Mhm.
And you'd have to have something which, forgive me, I don't think you have enough here, which is the limitations of the study.
Mhm.
So a comparative longitudinal would mean that you would, I don't know that this is the best tool for it, but what you would have to do is you would have to take 4 different samples, and they would have to be empire and non-empire, and they would have to, well, you could design the study various ways, but you would have to basically do comparative and longitudinal study at the same time in order to get what you're looking using this methodology. But this is not, yeah.
But can I push back though on the point you made about the acknowledging limitations? This method is contentious in the humanities, and there's a debate amongst my group that a lot of my colleagues are doing research that is far less reflexive than what I'm showing and far less concessionary, and just making arguments about the long history of gender in fiction, things like that. The debate is, I feel that the argument I've shown is nothing but the limitations. I basically conceded that the categories can be meaningless, the data could be flawed, the tool is potentially nonsensical. I haven't even really forwarded any arguments about, about literary history, which I've bracketed out because I really want this piece about, this talk to be about inherently the limitations of this method to be applied. So I want to push back on your feeling that what more would you need?
I think
That would not make impossible any generative work to emerge from this research.
Okay, you want to stop me, that's
No,
We've run out of time. This is a super interesting debate, but
Yes.
I'm sorry. Thanks, Richard,
Oh, yeah,
again
yeah.
for.
I hope that was possible. I hope that was possible. Yeah, thank you.